It was supposed to be nothing more than a family photograph, until the woman's gloves exposed something far darker. Dr. Amelia Richardson carefully unwrapped the layers of tissue paper surrounding the old wooden frame, her movements steady but deliberate. The chill of an early October morning drifted through her office window at the American Legacy Museum in Richmond, Virginia. As senior curator of post-Civil War African-American history, she'd handled countless relics from the past, yet this one made her pulse quicken. The package had arrived 3 days earlier. No sender, no return address. Inside it was a folded note written in neat, slanted script. "This belonged to my family. I believe it deserves to be seen and understood by more people. Please tell her story." Now the wrapping lay scattered across her desk. Before her sat an ornate Victorian frame, its carved flourishes dulled by age but still elegant. Inside it rested a black and white photograph that had somehow resisted the erosion of nearly a century and a half. The lower edge bore the faint impression of an embossed stamp, J. Morrison, portrait artist, Richmond, VA. A studio portrait from 1875. 6 figures filled the frame, a proud black family arranged with the formal precision typical of the era. At the center stood a distinguished man in his 40s, hand resting on the back of an intricately carved chair. Beside him sat a woman of similar age, posture upright and composed, her gaze calm but piercing. 4 children surrounded them, 2 boys and 2 girls, ranging in age from about 6 to 16, each dressed in fine, carefully chosen clothing that spoke of pride, success, and stability. Amelia had seen hundreds of such portraits, post-emancipation families asserting their dignity through the language of photography. These images were declarations of existence, proof of humanity, in a time when society still questioned it. But this one didn't rest easy in her mind. Something about it was off. Her eyes kept returning to the mother, not her face but her hands, or rather the gloves that covered them. They reached almost to her shoulders, a striking contrast to the shorter wrist-length styles fashionable in the 1870s. The material appeared to be fine kid leather or silk, dyed dark to complement her dress. It wasn't random, it was intentional. Amelia leaned closer. The woman's expression was poised, yet there was a depth behind her eyes. Sorrow, strength, something lived and unspoken. She turned the frame over. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "The Family, Richmond, Virginia, June 1875. May we never forget." The message hit her like a whisper from the past. Amelia straightened, the weight of curiosity tightening in her chest. She didn't yet know what the gloves meant, or what story the unknown sender wanted told, but she could feel it. This was no ordinary photograph. Placed the portrait beneath the soft light of her desk lamp and sat back, studying it with the calm focus of a detective rather than a curator. Every line, every shadow, every item in that image told part of a story. The man's suit was finely tailored but not extravagant, the work of someone who earned his living through skilled labor rather than inherited wealth. His hands were bare, resting naturally, the rough texture of his palms visible even in the old photograph. Those weren't the hands of a gentleman of leisure. They were the hands of a craftsman. The children mirrored the era's discipline. The eldest boy stood behind his father with quiet pride, while the younger children clutched each other's hands, a mixture of nervousness and importance in their stiff posture. Amelia smiled faintly. She'd seen that same tension before in countless early photographs. The long exposure times forced subjects to remain still for several seconds, so even children learned to hold their breath for history's sake. But again, her eyes drifted back to the woman. Something about her demanded attention. The long gloves, the slightly guarded positioning of her arms, the deliberate way her hands rested in her lap. It all felt purposeful, like a gesture designed to hide more than it revealed. Amelia zoomed in on a digital copy she'd just scanned. The gloves looked smooth at first glance, but the more she adjusted contrast and lighting, the more inconsistencies appeared. Tiny bumps and faint irregularities disturbed the surface, not enough to be wrinkles in the fabric. They looked like shapes. Her curiosity sharpened. Why would a woman in 1875 wear gloves that reached nearly to her shoulders? Fashion rarely demanded that level of coverage, even in the most formal portraits. And the color, nearly black, was unusual for daytime attire. It wasn't an aesthetic choice, it was concealment. Amelia turned the photo over again, rereading the faded inscription. May we never forget. Forget what? The historian in her couldn't ignore the possibility that the message and the gloves were connected. The note that had come with the package had been almost pleading. Please tell her story. Whoever sent it believed this woman's past mattered. And Amelia was beginning to see why. She leaned closer to the screen, eyes narrowed. The woman's face, magnified under digital light, seemed to change. Beneath the calm expression was something that looked almost defiant, as if she knew what she was hiding, and knew the world would never fully understand it. Amelia exhaled slowly, fingers tapping the edge of her desk. There were only a few reasons a woman of that era would go to such lengths to conceal her arms. None of them were innocent burns, disease, disfigurement, or... She caught herself before finishing the thought aloud. The museum was quiet. The hum of the scanner was the only sound. She clicked save on the image file, labeling it Richmond Family 1875. Then she reached for her phone. There was one person she trusted to help her read what the photograph refused to say. Dr. Marcus Chen, a forensic imaging specialist she had collaborated with before. Amelia composed a message. Marcus, I need your eyes on something. Old photograph. Unusual clothing detail. Might be more than it appears. Within minutes he replied, and send the file. I'll look tonight. She leaned back, staring once more at the family frozen in sepia, the father's steady gaze, the mother's elegant restraint. The children standing between past and future. Whatever that woman had endured, she had chosen to face the camera anyway, scars hidden, pride unbroken. Amelia didn't know it yet. But the truth beneath those gloves would reach far beyond fashion or mystery. It would lead her into the brutal, forgotten heart of a history America still hadn't fully faced. The following afternoon, Amelia's office became a small forensic lab. Dr. Marcus Chen arrived carrying his portable scanner and a weathered laptop, his usual calm giving way to a flicker of curiosity. You said the gloves looked wrong. Too long, too deliberate, Amelia replied, setting the framed photo on a velvet cloth. I need proof that I'm not just imagining things. Marcus adjusted the lighting so that no glare touched the glass. His scanner began to hum, inching across the image line by line, capturing details invisible to the naked eye. The process took hours. Amelia used the time to study Morrison's stamp again. The photographer had been progressive for his day, one of the few in Richmond willing to photograph black families. That explained the portrait's existence, but not its secret. When the scan completed, Marcus loaded the ultra-high-resolution composite onto his laptop. Both leaned close to the screen as he began enhancing contrast and depth. The sepia tones sharpened. Faces became clearer. The faint weave of clothing appeared in astonishing detail. Start with the gloves, Amelia said quietly. Marcus zoomed in on the woman's left arm. Under the enhancement filters, the smooth surface of the glove rippled with strange irregularities. He switched to infrared mapping. Light values shifted, exposing density variations beneath the cloth. He frowned. That's not just texture. Look here. These narrow parallel lines and those circular impressions near the wrist. Amelia's voice dropped. Restraint marks. He moved to the upper arm. New patterns emerged, crossing ridges, healed welts. And these, he murmured, are lash scars, extensive, both arms. The air in the office thickened. For a long moment neither spoke. The gloves, once a symbol of refinement, now read like armor. An elegant mask over brutality. Marcus ran measurement software, estimating wound age from the deformation patterns. The tissue damage looks old, decades before the photo. Probably before 1865, Amelia's stomach clenched, so she lived through it. She was enslaved, he nodded, and she chose to hide it, or maybe protect herself from how people would look at her if they saw. The revelation shifted the photograph entirely. What had seemed a proud family portrait was now an act of defiance, a woman reclaiming her image, refusing to let her scars define her legacy. Amelia closed her notebook slowly. If those scars are real, they're proof of what she endured. But to tell her story, I need her name. Marcus looked up from the glowing screen. Then that's your next step. Find the family. Outside, evening light spilled through the window, glinting off the glass that protected the century-old image. The woman in the gloves stared back at them, calm and composed. her secret finally whispering through the pixels. By dawn the next morning, Amelia was already in the museum's research wing, coffee forgotten beside a growing stack of records. The photograph sat upright on her desk, watching over her investigation like a silent witness. She began where any historian would, the photographer's mark. J. Morrison, portrait artist, Richmond, VA. Through the museum's digital archives, she uncovered fragments of Morrison's life. A Scottish immigrant who opened his Broad Street studio in 1867 and, unusually for his time, welcomed black clients. He'd been praised in a few old newspaper clippings for his progressive patronage. That explained why the family had chosen him. But his appointment ledgers were gone, likely destroyed in one of the fires that gutted downtown Richmond in the 1880s. That path ended there. Amelia switched focus to the family itself. She began sifting through the Freedmen's Bureau archives, property registries, tax rolls, anything between 1865 and 1875. It was slow work. Records of black families from Reconstruction were often incomplete, misfiled, or deliberately erased. Still, patterns began to form. She looked for signs of prosperity, property ownership, skilled trades, education. The man's hands in the photo told her he was no idle gentleman. Those calluses meant craftsmanship. She cross-referenced tradesmen, narrowing her search to carpenters, masons, and blacksmiths who owned homes in post-war Richmond. Hours turned into a day, and then into night. The city's ghosts began to take shape through census entries and faded deeds. Finally, a name leapt off the page. Daniel Freeman, a carpenter, listed as a free man of color. Purchased a small house on Clay Street in 1871, along with his wife Clara and 4 children, Elijah, Ruth, Samuel, and Margaret. The ages matched the family in the portrait almost perfectly. Her heart quickened, but she needed proof. She dug deeper. In a dusty Freedmen's Bureau marriage record from 1865, she found it, a document that sealed the connection. Daniel Freeman, colored freeman, born free before the war, seeks marriage to Clara, formerly enslaved, last held by R. Hartwell. Lancaster County, distinguishing marks, severe scarring on both arms from restraints and punishment. Amelia froze. The gloves, the scars, the inscription, everything aligned. She whispered the name aloud, almost reverently. Clara Freeman. For the first time, the woman in the photograph had an identity. Amelia printed every record she could find. Land deeds, census pages, birth lists. By 1875, the Freemans had built a life in Jackson Ward, a neighborhood soon to be called the Harlem of the South. Daniel ran his own carpentry shop. The children were listed as attending school, a miracle of progress for a family that, only a decade earlier, had lived under bondage. Still, something about the story felt incomplete. The gloves told of trauma, but the inscription, "May we never forget," suggested intention, not shame. Clara wasn't hiding from her past. She was memorializing it on her own terms. Amelia leaned back, staring at the family frozen in sepia light. They weren't symbols, they were survivors, builders, proof that endurance could look like elegance. She opened her laptop and began typing a post on an African-American genealogy forum. Seeking descendants of Daniel and Clara Freeman, Richmond, Virginia, circa 1870s, I may have found a family portrait connected to your lineage. Then she hit published at somewhere. She thought a descendant was waiting to be found, someone who still carried Clara's story in their blood. And when they did, Amelia would be ready to listen. The museum's halls were nearly silent that Sunday afternoon, the kind of stillness that only comes when history itself seems to be listening. Amelia sat at her desk, eyes fixed on her computer screen. It had been nearly 2 weeks since she posted her inquiry about the Freeman family. Most of the replies were dead ends, curious amateurs, mistaken identities, or people grasping at distant connections. Then, one email changed everything. The sender's name read Dorothy Freeman Williams. The subject line, "I think you found my great-great-grandmother." Amelia opened it immediately. The message was short but deliberate. "Dear Dr. Richardson, I've been researching my family history for over 30 years. When I saw your post mentioning Daniel and Clara Freeman of Richmond, I knew it had to be them. My grandmother, Ruth Freeman, told me stories about a portrait Clara insisted on having taken. even though it was costly. I have documents and family records that might help you. Please let me know if we can meet. Dorothy Freeman Williams, Washington, D.C. Amelia sat back, stunned. The photograph, silent for nearly 150 years, had finally spoken, and someone had heard. A week later, Dorothy arrived at the museum, a dignified woman in her late 60s, with a calm confidence that radiated quiet strength. Her eyes softened the moment she saw the portrait resting on the display stand. She stepped closer, her hand trembling slightly as she raised her glasses. "That's them," she whispered. "That's my family." Her voice cracked as she pointed toward each figure in turn. "Daniel, my great-great-grandfather. Clara, the woman in the gloves. And those 4 children, Elijah, Ruth, Samuel, and little Margaret. Ruth was my grandmother. She used to tell me how her mother made everyone stand still for that photograph. She said it was the proudest day of Clara's life." Amelia said nothing, allowing Dorothy the silence to absorb what decades of family memory could never visualize. After several moments, Dorothy opened the worn leather satchel she had brought and carefully placed it on Amelia's desk. Inside were neatly stacked papers, some folded into protective sleeves, others yellowed with age. "These have been passed down through the women in our family," she said softly. "Ruth gave them to my mother. My mother gave them to me. I think you should see them." The first document was a fragile marriage certificate, the same one Amelia had already found in the Bureau's archives, but this was the original. The next was a property deed for a modest home on Clay Street, dated 1871. But what stopped Amelia cold was a small bundle of lined paper tied with faded blue thread. "Clara wrote this herself," Dorothy explained. "In 1889, she had learned to read and write later in life. My grandmother said it was one of her proudest achievements, to finally tell her own story." Amelia's fingers brushed over the uneven handwriting. The ink had browned, but the lines were firm and deliberate, the kind of script that spoke of effort and conviction. The first sentence made her throat tighten. "My name is Clara Freeman. I was born Clara Hayes in 1831 on the Hartwell plantation in Lancaster County, Virginia. I do not know the exact date of my birth, only that my mother said it was spring when the tobacco was planted." Clara described growing up enslaved, working in the fields from the age of 6. She married a man named Joseph at 16, only to have him sold 2 years later. Their daughter died of fever before her first birthday. Then the writing shifted, harder and shakier, as if each word demanded strength. "When I was 14, I tried to run away to find my mother, who had been sold to North Carolina. I was caught after 3 days. They chained my wrists and made an example of me." The scars remained to remind me of the price of hope. Amelia looked up, her chest tight. Dorothy's eyes glistened with tears, but she nodded for her to keep reading. "In the confusion of war, I escaped again. I walked for days until I reached Richmond. There I met Daniel, a free man who taught me the value of building rather than running. He taught me that freedom is not just the absence of chains, but the right to stand upright before God and man." Amelia exhaled slowly. The gloves, the inscription's plea, "May we never forget," were no longer mysteries. They were the echo of a woman who refused to be erased. "I wore gloves in my photograph," Clara wrote, "not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted my children to be remembered for who they became, not what I endured. The scars are mine to bear. The future is theirs." Dorothy closed her eyes. "That's exactly what my grandmother said. She told me Clara wore those gloves as armor, not concealment. She wanted the picture to show dignity, not pity." Amelia nodded, her throat tight. "She understood image better than any historian ever could." They spent hours piecing together the family's history. Daniel's carpentry shop had prospered through the 1870s. The children had all gone to school. 2 became teachers. The Freemans were part of the early foundation of Jackson Ward, the same neighborhood that would, decades later, become the heart of black culture and enterprise in Richmond. Amelia realized the portrait wasn't just personal. It was political. It wasn't simply a record of a family. It was a declaration, a statement of survival, dignity, and ownership over one's own story. When Dorothy left the museum that evening, she paused beside the framed photograph. "You know," she said quietly, "in our family we were told to never forget where we came from, but I think Clara wanted more than remembrance. She wanted to be seen." Amelia looked at the portrait, at Clara's poised figure, at the long gloves concealing what history had carved into her skin. "She will be," she said firmly. "Now she finally will be." That night, Amelia stayed long after the museum closed. She opened a new file on her computer and typed the title, Clara Freeman, The Hidden Scars of Freedom. Below it, she wrote the first line of her upcoming exhibition proposal. It was just a family portrait, until the woman in the gloves taught us how survival looks when it wears its dignity like silk. The glow from her monitor cast the portrait's reflection onto the wall behind her. For the first time in nearly 150 years, Clara Freeman's story was no longer buried beneath fabric and silence. It was alive and ready to be told. For weeks, Amelia lived inside the story of Clara Freeman. Her office was no longer just a workspace. It had become a reconstruction site of memory. Maps of Reconstruction era. Richmond covered the walls. Copies of marriage records, land deeds, and census pages formed a paper mosaic that traced the Freeman family's rise from bondage to independence. The portrait of Clara and her family stood at the center of it all, encased in soft light. Every morning, Amelia greeted it like an old friend. She had written a preliminary proposal for a new exhibit, titled Uncovered, The Hidden Scars of Freedom. Its focus, Clara Freeman's story, as both an individual testimony and a symbol of how newly freed African Americans used photography to reclaim identity. But the more she worked, the more she realized how explosive it could be. This wasn't just about history, it was about truth. And truth, she knew, rarely came without resistance. 2 days later, she presented her draft to the museum's director. Dr. Elaine Moore, a pragmatic woman known for her caution when dealing with politically sensitive topics, Elaine scanned the pages in silence before setting them down. "You're suggesting we center an entire exhibit on one family?" "On one photograph," Amelia corrected. "But through that photograph, we tell the story of thousands." Elaine folded her arms. "You realize what that entails. We'd be confronting the physical brutality of slavery directly. Scars, punishments. These are not easy images to display to the public." Amelia didn't flinch. "They're harder to live with than to look at. Clara hid her scars not out of shame, but to control the narrative. It's our job to honor that, not to sanitize it." Elaine studied her for a long moment. "You believe this is bigger than one woman?" Amelia nodded. "I think Clara Freeman's portrait might be the most complete story of emancipation I've ever seen. Survival, dignity, defiance, all captured in a single frame." The director exhaled slowly. "All right. Draft the full exhibition plan. But you'll need to back every claim with verifiable research. And be prepared for scrutiny. Not everyone likes history when it stops being comfortable." By mid-November, word had begun to spread quietly through the historical community. A mystery photograph with hidden scars. A curator claiming to have identified a formerly enslaved woman through forensic imaging. Some colleagues were intrigued, others skeptical. A few questioned Amelia's interpretation outright. How can you be sure those marks are scars? Maybe it's fabric distortion or deterioration over time. You're building a story around one photo, risky for scholarship. Amelia absorbed every criticism, filing each remark in the mental space between irritation and motivation. She'd been in this field long enough to recognize fear disguised as skepticism. People weren't doubting her methods. They were afraid of what the story revealed, so she doubled down. She reran Marcus Chen's analysis, documenting every technical step. The imaging process, infrared readings, texture mapping, and the correlation between restraint scars and the glove distortions. She cited sources, medical parallels, and contextual evidence from Clara's own written testimony. She wasn't chasing belief. She was building proof. Late one evening, while sorting through a new shipment of archival materials, Amelia discovered something that felt like fate. A faded ledger labeled Morrison Studio 1873-1876. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were faint entries, mostly names and payment notes. But one stood out. June 10, 1875, Freeman Daniel. Family portrait. 6 subjects. Payment received in full. She closed her eyes, smiling through exhaustion. The missing link had surfaced. The photograph's origin was now irrefutable. The next morning, she placed a call to Dorothy Freeman Williams. "Dorothy, we found the photographer's record. It's official. Your great-great-grandparents commissioned that portrait on June 10, 1875. A pause on the line, then Dorothy's quiet voice. "That was 10 years after the war ended. Exactly a decade since Clara's freedom. She must have chosen that date on purpose." Amelia nodded to herself, even though Dorothy couldn't see it. "I think she did." She wasn't just marking a photograph. She was marking survival. By winter, the exhibit's design began to take shape. The centerpiece would be the Freeman portrait, restored and magnified on a large digital display that gradually revealed the hidden details, the texture beneath the gloves, the inscription on the back, and Clara's own words from her 1889 letter. Surrounding it would be panels chronicling the family's journey, Daniel's carpentry business, the children's education, and the rise of Jackson Ward as a beacon of black prosperity. Amelia titled one section, "Hands That Built Freedom." It would feature images of carpentry tools, period gloves, and excerpts from Clara's writings. "I built a life with these hands, though they were once bound. The world may forget the chains, but I will not." The deeper Amelia worked, the clearer it became that Clara's legacy wasn't about scars at all. It was about agency, a woman reclaiming her body, her image, and her story in a time when the world still wanted to define her by her pain. And as the museum began preparing for the public announcement, Amelia knew that what started as a mysterious photograph had become something far more dangerous and necessary. It wasn't just about one family in Richmond. It was about every voice history had once silenced. The announcement went live on a grey February morning. The American Legacy Museum presents Uncovered: The Hidden Scars of Freedom. Within hours, the museum's inbox flooded with media requests. The headline alone was enough to ignite curiosity and controversy. Local papers wanted interviews. Academic journals wanted citations. Talk shows wanted a soundbite. Amelia ignored most of it. She didn't want noise. She wanted clarity. The exhibit opened quietly, by invitation only. A small crowd filled the museum's East Gallery. Historians, descendants of Reconstruction families, a few skeptical colleagues, and standing in the front row, Dorothy Freeman Williams. The lights dimmed. On the wall behind Amelia, the enlarged image of the Freeman portrait appeared. 6 faces illuminated against a dark backdrop. Gasps rippled through the room. Even those who'd seen photographs of it before weren't prepared for the scale. Clara's eyes, magnified tenfold, seemed alive. Amelia stepped forward. "In this photograph," she began, "we see what freedom looked like 10 years after emancipation, but more importantly, we see what it cost. Clara Freeman's gloves are not a symbol of fashion. They're a testament to endurance. They conceal the physical memory of bondage while asserting her dignity as a free woman. This is not an image of pain. It's an image of victory." Silence followed, the kind that comes not from boredom, but from impact. Then Dorothy stepped up beside her, holding a small leather-bound notebook. "My great-great-grandmother wrote this in 1889, Dorothy said, her voice trembling only slightly. She said, "I wore gloves, so my children would be remembered for what we became, not for what was done to me." You could feel the audience exhale as one. The photograph that had once sat unseen in a box now filled the air with its weight. Over the next weeks, the exhibition exploded in popularity. Visitors packed the gallery, many standing silently before the portrait, some in tears. School. Groups came, teachers explaining how photography became a weapon of self-definition for freed families. Civil rights activists called it a bridge between past and present, but not everyone was comfortable. Certain media outlets accused the museum of reopening wounds. One conservative columnist called the exhibit an exercise in moral guilt disguised as art. Another claimed it was revisionist emotionalism. Amelia read every word and then went back to work. She wasn't interested in arguments. The portrait spoke for itself. Still, the scrutiny took its toll. She received angry letters, one even suggesting she fabricated the scars digitally. For every message of gratitude, another accused her of exploiting history. When Marcus Chen dropped by one evening, he found her sitting alone in the darkened gallery. "You knew it would happen," he said softly. "I did," she replied. "But I didn't expect it to feel like this. You touched a nerve, that's what truth does." They stood together before the image, two researchers dwarfed by a century-old photograph that had somehow become a mirror for the present. "You realize," Marcus said, "this isn't just her story anymore, it's yours too. You gave her voice back." Amelia shook her head. "No, she never lost it. We just finally stopped talking over her." 2 weeks later, a letter arrived addressed to Amelia in looping handwriting. Inside was a note from a woman in South Carolina. "I brought my daughter to see Clara's portrait. She asked me why the woman was wearing gloves, and I told her the truth. Then she said, 'That means she was strong. Thank you for showing my child that kind of strength.'" Amelia folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer beside the first note, the one that had arrived with the photograph months earlier. "This belonged to my family. Please tell her story." She smiled faintly. The request had been fulfilled. But deep down, she knew Clara Freeman's story wasn't over. History never ends with discovery, only with understanding. The museum announced that the exhibit would go national. Requests came from Chicago, Atlanta, and New York. The Smithsonian sent an inquiry. Scholars began citing the Freeman case as a model for integrating forensic science with cultural history. Clara, at last, was being recognized as both survivor and symbol, the woman who turned silence into testimony. On the night before, the exhibit closed in Richmond, Amelia stood alone before the portrait. The room was dim, the only light coming from the image itself. Clara's gaze met hers across the centuries, calm, knowing, unbroken. "You did it," Amelia whispered. "You made them remember." The reflection of the gloves shimmered faintly under the light, as if the silk itself had a pulse. Freedom, Amelia thought, doesn't erase scars. It teaches you how to wear them. Clara's echo months later, long after the Richmond exhibit had closed and the Freeman portrait was carefully packed for its national tour, Amelia drove 3 hours east to Lancaster County, Virginia, Clara's birthplace. It was early spring, the same season Clara had written about in her letter. "I was born when the tobacco was planted. The air was heavy with the scent of rain and tilled soil. The landscape wide and open, dotted with the remains of plantations long since turned to farmland." Amelia parked on the shoulder of a narrow dirt road where a faded sign read, "Hartwell Plantation Historical Site." There wasn't much left. A crumbling stone foundation, a handful of oak trees older than any living memory. And silence. She stood there for a long while, notebook in hand, the hum of cicadas breaking the quiet. Somewhere beneath this earth, Clara Hayes had worked as a child, her hands raw, her back burning under the same sun that now warmed Amelia's skin. The irony wasn't lost on her. A century and a half ago, this soil had been watered by suffering. Today, a historian stood here because one woman refused to be erased. She walked slowly through what had once been the plantation yard. Bits of brick and pottery poked through the grass. In one spot she knelt, brushing away a layer of dirt to reveal a rusted metal shackle link half buried in the soil. It wasn't shocking, just confirmation. She didn't take it. Instead, she whispered to the ground, "She made it out. She lived free. You didn't win." The wind moved through the trees like an answer. Back in Richmond, the Freeman portrait was already becoming legend. The exhibit had sparked discussions in universities, sermons in churches, and tears from visitors who saw their ancestors reflected in Clara's eyes. Amelia watched from the sidelines as journalists, academics and descendants filled the air with analysis and praise. Yet she stayed quiet. For her, the work wasn't about fame. It was about restoration, returning one woman's humanity to the record of history. She and Dorothy remained close, speaking weekly. Dorothy had attended every major showing of the portrait, greeting visitors as if welcoming them into her family's home. Her calm dignity reminded Amelia so much of Clara that it sometimes made her chest ache. One evening, Dorothy called and said softly, "You know, my grandmother used to say that strength runs in the blood, even if the world forgets the names. Thanks to you, they'll never forget hers." Amelia swallowed hard. "It was never about me, Dorothy. She told her story long before I came along. I just finally listened." A year after the exhibit's debut, the museum held a small memorial event to honor the Freeman family. The crowd was modest: scholars, community members, and a few descendants. Dorothy spoke last, her voice steady but full of emotion. "Clara Freeman's scars are history's handwriting," she said. "They tell us what was done, but they also tell us what survived. My family stands here today because one woman decided that pain would not be her final story." The audience rose in quiet applause. When the lights dimmed, the final image projected on the screen wasn't the portrait itself, but Clara's words, written in her uneven, earnest handwriting. "Freedom is not forgetting the chains. It is learning how to live with what they leave behind." Later that night, when the museum was empty again, Amelia walked through the gallery alone. The portrait hung under soft illumination, its carved Victorian frame gleaming faintly. She looked up at Clara's composed face, the faint suggestion of a smile hidden in the corners of her mouth. The gloves were still there, elegant, deliberate, eternal. "You were right to hide them," Amelia whispered. "You knew the world wouldn't understand. But now they do." The silence that followed was full, not hollow, the kind that comes after justice, however delayed. Outside, rain began to fall gently against the museum's glass walls. The sound mingled with the low hum of the building's lights, a rhythm that felt almost like breath. Amelia stood for a final moment, then turned to leave. As she walked away, she caught Clara's reflection one last time in the polished glass, a faint shimmer of gloves, eyes, and quiet defiance. History had tried to bury her, but Clara Freeman had outlasted it, and through the woman who finally told her story, she still spoke.